Good afternoon, all. I am excited to be here with you today to share a bit about our graduation speaker, Carl Pope. As head of the Sierra Club, there are some obvious ties between Carl's work and College of the Atlantic. But what I hope I can share with you today is a bit more about Carl as an entire person passionate for change and not just a director of an environmental organization. One early story about Carl perhaps best illustrates his passion for change and idealist nature. In the fall of 1966, during the midst of the turmoil of the Vietnam War, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert S. Mcnamara was arriving onto the Harvard campus for a small meeting with a select group of students to discuss the war. As one of the many students outraged by the war, Carl joined fellow activists in surrounding Mcnamara's car and demanding a more open debate on the war. Pope even lay down in front of Mcnamara's vehicle to demand he confront the full student body. The passion he brings to his work and demand for change has not faltered. Like many yearning for change, Carl joined the Peace Corps and worked in India on family planning, education in small villages. Returning from the Peace Corps, he continued similar work with the organization Zero Population Growth. Interestingly, Carl cites his interest in environmentalism as stemming from the Clean Air Act. Quote, "As we breathe the same air, we all breathe the same air, and there's only one ozone layer. What attracted me at this point was that environmentalism was one of the causes that brought a broad spectrum of society together. That's still true in many cases." After becoming restless in DC, Carl left Zero Population Growth and moved to California, where he quickly became part of the dynamic Sierra Club in San Francisco. Since beginning with the club, he has worked as a lobbyist, community organizer, fundraiser, and analyst. His work in environmentalism has reached beyond the traditional constituencies to steelworkers and inner-city youth. He also co-wrote the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986, known as California's Proposition 65. In many ways, his dedication and tireless work on many levels within the Sierra Club provided him with the grounded skills that has made him invaluable as head of the club. In his position as executive director, Carl helped grow the organization and has recentered the work of the club to focus on what it stands for rather than against. In revisioning the organization, Carl notes, quote, "We have a tendency to act as if people are motivated mainly by anger or fear, when in fact we know better, that hope and optimism are more critical motivational factors. In this way, it is evident that the passion and commitment from Pope's early days have continued as a foundational part of his motivations and has shaped the Sierra Club in a positive way." Without further ado, I would like to introduce our 2010 graduation speaker, Carl Pope.
Let me begin by congratulating the class of 2010 and thanking you all for giving me the occasion to be here. I also want to thank President Hale and Chairman Folk, distinguished ambassadors, the trustees of the College of Atlantic, and all of the guests who are here today. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's a little bit embarrassing to be here. These rituals have a certain routine to them. To begin with, we've heard it called a graduation event, and we've also heard it called a commencement event. Now, those are actually antonyms in English. One means a beginning and one an ending. It's pretty clear what's ending. Your 4 years at the College of Atlantic is ending. But what is it precisely that is commencing? Having listened now to 4 of you, you don't seem to me like you're just being your tabula rasa who are beginning. You seem like you actually have done quite a bit already. So I suppose the symbolism of this event is that you're about to pass from being people who were supposed to learn things from people of my generation to people who were supposed to learn things on your own. And this is the last bit of wisdom that my generation is supposed to pass on to you. But looking at the Gulf of Mexico, I have to wonder whether anybody of my generation should be allowed on podiums like this to pass on wisdom to your generation. Now, because of the fortuitous geography of Cape Cod, I can be reassuring. What's happened in the Gulf of Mexico will probably not have much of an impact on the wonderful coastline behind us, but that's really about all the reassurance I can offer you. So, what is to be learned by you that I stand here as a symbol of? Is it really as pathetic as do what I'm about to say and not what we did? I do think there's one observation that my generation probably can make. Your generation is going to have to do things differently, not because you've been well trained to do so, although I hope you have, but because you won't actually have any choice. Never before have there been 7 billion human beings on the planet, heading towards 9. Never before have 2/3 of those human beings lived in societies that have mastered the trick of becoming consumers. Never before have 4 billion new consumers been launched to harvest the world's biological ecosystems. Never before have those biological ecosystems already been fully exploited, harvested, or over-harvested. There are no new wetlands, forests, prairies, or even oceans for the 4 billion new consumers who are going to arrive in the next 20 years to harvest. For millennia, it was human beings who were nomadic. We moved around the world in search of new climates and new opportunities, but once we got to Bengaluru or San Francisco or Cape Town or New York, they were pretty stable. The Maldives in 1200 were pretty much the same size they are today. Now we don't need to move if we want change. It's climate that's on the move. Change is going to seek us. There's no longer any place where we can simply say it's going to be the way it's always been. That's not an option that your generation has. In 1892, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner gave a famous speech called "The Frontier and the American Character" to celebrate the fact that the Census Bureau had determined in 1890 that the settlement frontier, the agricultural frontier in American history, had closed. I want to suggest today that with Deepwater Horizon, or perhaps last year, when China passed the United States as the world's largest emitter of carbon dioxide, that with those two events, the fossil fuel frontier has closed. Just as the farming frontier shaped 19th century America, it was the fossil fuel frontier that drove this nation in the 20th century. In his speech, Turner asked the question, who do Americans become now that the farming frontier has closed? And Teddy Roosevelt's generation answered that question. In 1892, the same year that Turner gave his speech, both the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society were formed. By 1908, President Roosevelt had convened the first White House Conference on Conservation. By 1912, when he left office, Roosevelt had set aside 100 million acres of the American landscape to be preserved for the future. And in 1916, only a brief period of time after Turner's speech, Sur-des-Monts National Monument, today Acadia National Park behind us, was set aside. Your generation is going to have to answer a different question. What is America to become now that the fossil fuel frontier has closed? And where can you look to find the answers to that question? I would suggest not to the generation represented by myself standing up here, Because if we had found that answer, if we knew that answer, we would all not be witnessing the spectacle today of pelicans drowning in crude oil from Mississippi Canyon off the Louisiana coast. So all I can do is offer 3 mistakes we made, and you might want to consider not repeating them. The first mistake is to be skeptical of the 2 dominant forms of knowledge in our society. One is tribal knowledge. I believe something because people like me believe it. It's probably a good way to pick music. It's what Amazon does when they tell you what books you want to buy. Tribal knowledge is a way of solving problems. It's likely to be very misleading. And the second form of knowledge we rely on is what I will call priestly knowledge, the sense that somebody else, she has spent her whole lifetime learning all the details of this problem, so I'm going to let her make the decision for me about what we ought to do. My experience with Robert McNamara illustrates the perils of both forms of knowledge. Robert McNamara pursued the Vietnam War because priestly knowledge told him it was the right thing to do. The foreign policy military experts said, Vietnam is a small backward society, and if it becomes communist, the whole world will. And so McNamara followed the priests of his defense establishment and took America into war in Vietnam. I lay down in front of McNamara's car because that was what people who thought and dressed the way I did thought we should do. I remember at the time when the protest was planned, asking in the meeting the question, what are we actually trying to accomplish here? And the records of public sentiment on the Vietnam War show that lying down in front of Robert McNamara's car actually made him and the war more popular in the United States. So both tribal knowledge and priestly expertise are perhaps to be distrusted. They haven't done my generation too well. So what do you use? What is the alternative form of knowing? We live in a very complicated world. We are all asked every day to solve problems about which we cannot possibly have detailed personal knowledge. I get on airplanes. I don't really know why they're safe, but I get on them. I think what we need a lot more of in the next generation is reliance on what in philosophy class you were probably, at least I was taught to call a heuristic, a rule of thumb, common sense. So I'm going to suggest us look at global warming. I would urge you not to worry about global warming because everyone you know does. That's not really a very good reason to think about global warming. I would also say you shouldn't really worry about global warming simply because the UN's IPCC says you should worry about global warming. That's priestly knowledge. Well, I do think you should worry about global warming. I do. First of all, I can observe it. I can see pieces of Antarctica falling into the ocean. I can see spring coming earlier. Global warming is something I'm experiencing. And that, as a matter of common sense, I think is something I can trust. Second, global warming makes sense. I know enough chemistry to know that greenhouse molecules, greenhouse pollution, store more radiant energy in the Earth's atmosphere, and that in effect what we are doing is we are turning up the burner underneath the global climate. Now, when I turn up the burner in my kitchen, I do not know precisely when the water will boil over. And I need to watch it if what I want is for the water to boil. But if I don't want the water to boil, I know what to do. I turn the burner down. So you don't really need to have a lot of priestly knowledge to know that we ought to do something about greenhouse pollution, even if you don't believe that it's already happening. There's some other examples of recent crises, which if we had applied rules of the thumb, we might have been able to avoid. The housing bubble, the great economists are telling us it was very complicated. Nobody could really predict that there was going to be a housing bubble. Well, people can only spend a certain amount of their income on housing. For decades, it was a rule of thumb in this country. It was a rule of thumb. It's how you got a loan. You couldn't spend more than a third of your income on housing. Nobody would give you a loan for a mortgage you couldn't pay off. So why was it so complicated to realize that when banks began to give people mortgages which would require 2/3 of their income to pay off, that this was probably a bubble? Priestly knowledge didn't tell us. Tribal behavior didn't tell us. Rules of thumb could have told us. What does common sense tell us about the Deepwater Horizon and our reliance on oil? I'm going to suggest that a country with 2% of the oil reserves, and most of those in places like the Mississippi Canyon, very dangerous and expensive to use, shouldn't be depending its economy on oil and burning 25% of the world's oil. Not when it has the choice to electrify cars and railroads, put trucks on natural gas, fly planes with biofuels, and build neighborhoods where people can use their feet. Another lesson from Deepwater Horizon. Equipment that works very well, and it does, in 500 feet of water, and which can be fixed by a diver, may not work very well in 5,000 feet of water, where a piece of equipment the size of this paper has 160 tons of pressure bearing down on it. Deepwater Horizon should not have been a surprise. Neither the tribal knowledge of the oil industry nor the priestly calculation of the Minerals Management Service figured that out, but common sense could have told us. That's one mistake we made. We learned the wrong way. Mistake number 2. This one's a bit contradictory. We embraced the impossible when there were better alternatives. I'm going to suggest that you might embrace the impossible, but only when there are no better answers. The closing of the fossil fuel frontier is going to require that we do things very differently. We're not going to be able to build prosperity with what we mine or pump from the earth. We're going to have to build prosperity between our ears. We might actually consider stopping using oil before we run out, because producing the last drop of oil may turn out to be both very expensive and very dangerous. But right now we're having a conversation about how to approach the problem of oil based on the premise that we have no choice. There is a regular drumbeat of messages in the media saying, we must use oil, oil is there, therefore we will use oil. Those who try to say that oil is dangerous to burn, dangerous to pump, and dangerous to import, and that we should do something else, are told by very knowledgeable people, don't be silly, it's there, we're going to use it. I've heard American presidents, all the way back to Richard Nixon, promise the country that they would do something about energy independence, and they were immediately followed by experts who said, don't pay too much attention to that. That's eye candy for the voters. We can't do anything about it. What are the results? We see them. War in Iraq, ice caps melting, 3.2 million American jobs exported each way to pay for the oil we import, the Gulf of Mexico in the intensive care unit. So perhaps we should say, is there a better answer than getting off oil? What's so impractical about electric cars? How about railroads that are as good as the ones they have in China? Mass transit that is equal to that in a medium-sized European city? and sidewalks in our neighborhoods like our grandparents had. Yet that vision is widely perceived as being an impossible dream. And the vision of drilling holes in the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico is seen as the practical, simple solution. So I'm going to suggest it's very important to get this concept right. We should embrace the bold, but only when we don't have a better idea. Your generation is going to face lots of problems for which the solutions will be breathtakingly ambitious and difficult. Don't try to do impossible things that you don't need to. Our final and probably our most profound mistake, we treated our ethical values like the handbag that you match with the rest of your outfit when you finish getting dressed to go out for the evening. Just something to be picked up after all the important decisions have been made. And incidentally, we now have business schools teaching classes in business ethics, which just metaphorically sends the signal. This is a nice little feature. Ethics are actually foundational. They determine how everything turns out. They're the most important thing we have. They're what make us human. And in particular, I think your generation might learn from my generation the importance of knowing when to stop. We don't have to push everything to the ultimate limit that we think we can get away with. Let humility, restraint, and self-discipline accompany ambition, aspiration, and pride in the architecture of your character. The core insight that enabled Teddy Roosevelt's generation to solve the problem of the closing of the farming frontier was that they needed to take a big chunk of this continent and set it aside and not do anything with it. They didn't log it, they didn't mine it, they didn't build on it. They just said, yes, we can do things with the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and the National Forest. We're not going to do those things. This is not easy. Human beings are, biologically, natural selection does work, aggressive, opportunistic, short-sighted, risk-taking primates. Take a close, but not too close look at our nearest relatives, the chimpanzees. They are not a moral model for a society equipped with nuclear power plants and AK-47s. We are sadly, apparently, not descended from their much nicer cousins, the bonobos. How can we stop acting like chimps? You've made a good start in the last 4 years. I think in many ways, cultivating your not chimpness is what your experience at the College of the Atlantic has been all about. But it's not easy. And I had the honor of having 2 conversations recently with people who were creating first-in-nation 4-year liberal arts colleges in societies that don't have places like the College of the Atlantic. One is Ashesi University in Accra, Ghana, which has been open for about 5 years. And the other is a yet-to-be-born Arusha campus of the Aga Khan University in Kenya. And what was striking to me was that in the course of the first 5 minutes that both of these founders were describing what they were trying to do with these colleges and what was important about them, they both described in almost identical words that the reason for the creation of these institutions was to build a leadership generation for these societies with stronger ethical foundations, and that the expertise-based British educational system, which both Kenya and Uganda inherited from the colonial era, simply did not do that as well as the American liberal arts model. And I thought that was quite striking. These people did not know each other, but they had both come to this kind of institution as the solution to that problem. So the bad news, since you've been here at the College of Atlantic for 4 years, you don't have the excuse that you don't have the tools. You need to decide to use them. My generation didn't do a very good job of it. We took oil drilling technology that we had tested in 500 feet of water, and we simply pushed it down to 5,000 feet. We didn't start America down the road to freedom from oil, even though we didn't have a better answer. And we have allowed our nation's response to global warming to get bogged down in a sterile debate between the priestly expertise of the climate scientists and the tribal wisdom of the oil industry. I could go on. My generation made lots of other mistakes, but it would quite simply be too embarrassing. May our folly be your wisdom. Thank you.
Carl, thank you for that extremely thought-provoking and amusing and deep and light speech, which I think you've passed the ball to the right generation, because every time you said our generation, I was thinking, so it's over to you guys. Anyway, now I have the great pleasure to present an honorary Master of Philosophy degree in human ecology to Carl Pope.
I don't know enough yet.